Welcome to Dr. Ishan Arya's Deep Dish Dialogues. And welcome back. Great to be here again, ready to dive into this stack of sources you've brought. Looks like some really fascinating historical science today.
Absolutely. Looking forward to unpacking these with you. We've got some compelling stuff.
Yeah, it looks like a real mix. Articles, research papers. We're going deep into the human past, but from, well, pretty different angles, it seems.
Exactly. And our goal, like always in these dives, is to, sift through it all together, pull out the key insights, find those little surprising details.
And make sense of the big picture without getting totally bogged down in jargon.
Right.
Yeah.
Precisely. And today, we've got two really distinct areas. One looks at the evolution of our own hands based on a specific fossil find.
Okay.
And the other shifts to the ancient genetic history of populations in South Asia. So, quite a contrast.
A definite contrast from one bone to millions of genomes, but both telling us about our deep past, just in, very different ways. Okay, let's start with the hand. What's this first discovery about?
All right, so this first piece comes from an article in PNAS. It's all about an early Pleistocene fossil, specifically a third metacarpal bone found in Kenya.
The third metacarpal, that's the long bone in the palm connected to the middle finger, right? And this specific fossil, KNM-WT51260, what can you tell us about it?
That's the one. It's a remarkably well-preserved, the right third metacarpal, found in a site called Kaitio, which is in northern Kenya, just west of Lake Turkana, a really important area for hominin fossils.
Then how old are we talking? What's the date on this bone?
We're looking at approximately 1.42 million years ago. The researchers were able to date it pretty precisely because it comes from a layer associated with a known volcanic ash, the Locopetamoi tuff.
1.42 million years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the big deal about this specific bone? What's the feature that makes it so significant?
The really crucial feature is something called the styloid process. It's very distinct on this fossil.
Styloid process. Can you explain that simply? What is it? Yeah, think of it as a noticeable bony projection, sort of a bump, right there on the base of the bone, where that metacarpal meets the small bones in your wrist, the carpals.
Okay, a bony bump. Why is that so important in the grand scheme of human evolution?
Well, its significance lies in the fact that it's considered a derived characteristic, basically a newer trait that evolved in our lineage. You see it consistently in modern human hands and also in Neanderthal hands. But, and this is key, Wade, it's absent in apes. And in the earlier hominins we know about, like Ardipithecus, Australopithecus sediba, even Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, just don't have it.
Right. And here's the kicker. From what I read in the article, we used to think this feature showed up much, much later.
Exactly. That's the surprising part. Before this find, the clear evidence for this fully formed styloid process, well, it really only came from later archaic humans. We're talking maybe 800,000 years ago, possibly even more recent.
So this fossil,
This 1.42 million-year-old fossil pushes the evidence for this modern-looking hand feature back by over 600,000 years. It's a huge jump.
more than 500,000 years. That really shifts the timeline for when our hands started looking and presumably functioning more like they do today. So function. What does this styloid process actually do?
Its main job is mechanical. It provides stability. It really enhances hand function, especially when you're putting a lot of force through your hand, like when making or using tools.
Okay.
It helps stabilize those joints between the hand bones and the wrist bones, the carpal-metacarpal joints. It braces them against the loads when you're doing a powerful grip, especially with the thumb opposing the fingers.
Like gripping a hammerstone or something?
Precisely. Or napping flint. It acts like a buttress, really.
Yeah.
It prevents the joint from hyperextending or partially dislocating, allowing for much more forceful and controlled manipulation.
That makes perfect sense. Stability, control, force, all crucial for tool work. But hang on a minute. Didn't early tool use start way before 1.42 million years ago? I mean, we have Oldowan tools going back over 2.5 million years, right?
You're absolutely right. The very earliest stone tools, like those from Gona around 2.58 Mia, or maybe even those contested Dakika cut marks at 3.39 Maya, they definitely predate this specific hand structure.
So tool use came first, then the specialized hand.
It seems so. But what's happening around 1.75 million years ago, roughly overlapping with this fossil's time period, is the emergence and spread of more complex technology. We start seeing the Acheulean tradition, those more carefully shaped bifacial tools like hand axes.
Ah, okay. So sites like Kokosel I4, Konso,
Yeah.
that's when we see this technological step up.
Exactly. And the thinking is that the increasing reliance on making and using these more sophisticated tools likely created the selective pressure favoring this more modern hand morphology.
So the behavior more complex tool use drove the evolution of the physical structure?
That's what this fossil strongly suggests. It provides direct anatomical evidence that this key structural change, enabling that kind of demanding, precise manipulation, happened relatively early in our genus, Homo, probably in Homo erectus broadly defined.
Yeah.
It really ties the anatomy directly to the behavioral context of early Pleistocene tool technology.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that they could make tools, but that making better, more complex tools was becoming so important it shaped their very bones.
Did the article mention anything else about the fossil's appearance?
Yes, a couple of interesting points. Apart from the styloid process, the overall shape and proportions of the bone are very much like a modern human's.
Yeah.
And its length actually suggests the individual was quite tall.
Really? How tall?
Well, based on the bone length, they estimate potentially over 167 centimeters, so, over 5'5" or 5'6". And they emphasize that the styloid process itself isn't intermediate. It's not halfway there. It looks unequivocally like ours in the Neanderthals.
Okay, so let's sum up this first deep dive for you, our listener. This single bone, KNMWT 51260, a middle metacarpal from Kenya dated to 1.42 million years ago, is a game changer. It tells us a critical feature of our modern hand there. The styloid process, essential for powerful, precise grip, evolved over 500,000 years earlier than we thought. And it strongly links this anatomical shift to the rise of more complex Acheulean tool technology. It's a fantastic example of how our biology and our behavior, specifically toolmaking, were intertwined very early in the story of Homo, form and function evolving together.
All right.
That was fascinating. Now, let's pivot. We're making a big jump from a single bone in Africa millions of years ago to the genetics of millions of people across South Asia, much more recently, relatively speaking.
It's definitely shifted in scale and methods.
Yeah.
Here we're looking at sources like a Y chromosome study from PubMed, a big ancient DNA paper in Science, and also drawing on some background from mitochondrial DNA research.
And the core question is, what can genetics, both the male line through the Y chromosome and these whole ancient genomes, tell us about how the incredibly diverse populations of South Asia actually formed? Where did people come from? How did they mix?
Okay, starting with that Y chromosome study, looking just at the male lineage. One of the main findings reported is that the genetic contribution from Central Asian pastoralist groups impacting the gene pool already present in South Asia seems to have been relatively minor.
Minor. That sounds significant. Doesn't that challenge some common narratives?
It does push back against models that proposed a really large recent wave of migration from Central Asia, dramatically reshaping the existing genetic landscape. The Y chromosome data suggests a more complex picture.
So what does it suggest instead? More ancient roots within the region.
Exactly. The study highlights deep regional differentiation within South Asian Y chromosomes, with patterns suggesting divergence times exceeding 10,000 or even 15,000 years. This points to a lot of history unfolding within the subcontinent. Even for haplogroups sometimes linked to later movements, like R1A1, the fine-grained analysis suggests different, more recent histories for populations in, say, the Indus Valley area versus those further south in the peninsula.
Interesting. Did that study touch on language groups like Dravidian speakers?
Yes. It mentions that the Y chromosome patterns are actually more consistent with a peninsular origin for Dravidian speakers, rather than an origin near the Indus Valley. It also points to gene flow related to the spread of agriculture playing a role.
So the overall message from the Y DNA is more about ancient internal dynamics and maybe less about recent large-scale replacements?
Pretty much. The study concludes that the Y chromosome landscape seems to be shaped more by expansions and movements happening before and during the early Holocene, rather than being dominated by later, say, Indo-European associated migrations.
Okay, that's the Y chromosome perspective. Now let's bring in the ancient DNA study from Science. This looks at whole genomes from ancient remains. What were the main ancestral ingredients they found?
Right. This study gives us a much more detailed picture by looking at the entire genome. They identified 3 primary source populations that have contributed to modern South Asians since the Bronze Age.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's a group they call Ancient Ancestral South Indians, or AASI. This represents a very distinct, deeply rooted Asian lineage, likely related to the first modern humans who reached the region.
So deeply indigenous. Got it. Number 2.
Second is the Indus Periphery Klein group. These are people represented by ancient individuals found near the sphere of the Indus Valley civilization. Their ancestry is predominantly related to ancient Iranian farmers.
Okay, linked to the Indus civilization and early farmers to the west. And the third.
Third is ancestry related to Central Steppe Middle to Late Bronze Age populations, or Central Steppe MLBA. These were people from the grasslands of Central Asia who themselves were a mixture of earlier steppe pastoralists and groups with ancestry related to European farmers.
Right, so we have these three mainstreams: deep indigenous ASI, Indus-related Iranian former ancestry, and later steppe pastoralist ancestry. How did they mix to create the populations we see today? This sounds complicated.
It is complex, and the timing is crucial. This ancient DNA study sheds light on the formation of the two major ancestral components often discussed: ASI, ancestral South Indians, and ANI, ancestral North Indians. A key finding is that much of the formation of both ASI and ANI seems to have happened after the main period of the Indus Valley civilization, mostly during the second millennium BCE.
After the IVC. So these ancestral groups weren't fully formed before then.
Apparently not, according to this data. Their formation was a process happening later. Let's try to walk through it. The ASI component. Think of it forming from a mixture between the indigenous ASI group and the Indus periphery Klein group.
So indigenous people mixing with the Indus-related people.
Yes. And importantly, this means that even the deepest ASI-related ancestry in South Asia does carry some of that Iranian farmer-related component, but it came via mixing with the Indus periphery people. Some tribal groups in the South are genetically very close to the most extreme ASI profile identified.
Okay, that's ASI. What about ANI, ancestral North Indians?
ANI formed predominantly from a mixture between that same Indus periphery Klein group, the ones with the strong Iranian farmer link, and the incoming Central Steppe MLBA groups. ANI generally has a higher proportion of the Indus periphery ancestry compared to ASI, plus that significant contribution from the steppe.
So different blends of the same ingredients happening roughly around the same time after the IVC's peak.
Exactly. It wasn't like there was a static ANI population and a static ASI population from the beginning. Their formation was a dynamic mixing process occurring during the second millennium BCE, involving interactions between ASI, Indus periphery, and steppe MLBA ancestries.
Now, the study delves into that steppe ancestor specifically. This can be a sensitive topic. What exactly does the paper report about it? Let's be clear, we're relaying the study's findings here.
Right. So the study reports, based on their analysis of ancient and modern genomes, that the steppe MLBA ancestry found in South Asia shows a strong signal of being male-biased.
Male-biased, meaning more contribution through male lines than female lines.
Correct. That's the pattern they observed in the genetic data. They interpret this pattern as suggesting specific kinds of social interactions during the period of mixing between steppe-related groups and the existing populations of South Asia.
And did they find this steppe ancestry distributed evenly or concentrated in certain groups?
The study reports that it's found at disproportionately higher levels today in certain groups. They specifically mention Brahmin and Bhumihar groups, who, as they note, are traditionally associated with the custodianship of liturgical texts composed in Sanskrit.
Okay. And how do the authors of the study interpret that specific finding the male bias and the concentration in certain groups linked to Sanskrit traditions?
Again, relaying their interpretation presented in the paper, they state that this pattern provides independent genetic evidence that aligns with the steppe origin for the Indo-European languages spoken in South Asia.
So they connect the dots between the male-biased steppe genetic signal and its prevalence in groups historically linked with early Indo-European language traditions in the region.
That is the interpretation put forward in the source material, yes. They argue the genetic data fits a model where migrating steppe groups played a key role in introducing these languages.
All right. So let's try to wrap up this genetics section for you, the listener. These studies, especially the ancient DNA one, paint a really rich, multi-layered picture. We have deep indigenous roots from ASI. We have strong connections to the people of the Indus Valley civilization era, who themselves had links to early farmers further west via the Indus periphery Klein ancestry. Then we see the arrival of groups from the Central Asian steppe, bringing steppe MLBA ancestry, with evidence suggesting this contribution was primarily male-driven. And crucially, the major mixing that formed the basis of the modern north-south genetic Klein, the ASI Klein, happened largely after the IVC's peak, throughout the second millennium BCE and likely continuing.
It really emphasizes that South Asian genetic history isn't about simple replacements, but about complex long-term interactions and mixing between diverse groups. The genetic landscape today reflects all these layers.
Wow, what a journey today. We went from focusing on a tiny bump on a 1.42 million-year-old hand bone in Kenya,
all the way to the intricate genetic tapestry of hundreds of millions of people across South Asia, formed over the last few millennia.
It's just amazing how these different lines of evidence, a fossil fragment, ancient and modern DNA, can open up these incredible windows into our past.
It really highlights the power of this kind of research. Seemingly small details that styloid process, specific genetic markers, they unlock vast stories about biology, about behavior, technology, migration, connecting continents in vast stretches of time.
Absolutely. It makes you think, doesn't it? How something like the physical evolution of our hands, gaining that structure for better manipulation, might have fundamentally changed our ancestors' behavior and driven technological innovation.
And conversely, how those echoes of ancient migrations and population mixtures revealed by genetics aren't just abstract history. They're literally carried within people living today, shaping the incredible diversity we see across South Asia and beyond.
A lot to mull over. The deep past is definitely not dead history. It's still with us, in our bones and in our genes.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you, and see you in the next discussion.